There is a circle carved into the Sahara Desert, so large that no human standing inside it can see its shape. 25 miles across. Perfect concentric rings of stone, one inside the next, wrapping a central point in the middle of nothing. For thousands of years, nobody knew it was there. You cannot see it from a camel. You cannot see it from a dune. You cannot see it from the highest hill in Mauritania. It was only found in 1965, when two astronauts looked down from orbit and saw the desert staring back at them like an enormous eye. And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Plato described this. Not something like it, this. Rings of land and water wrapped around a central island, in a great plain walled by mountains to the north, opening to the sea in the south. A circular city, ringed, measured, and then lost. He gave the diameter, he gave the layout, he gave the shape, and it sat in the sand, unseen, for the entire span of recorded history, until we got high enough to look. Most people walk right past the rest of the story. They hear Atlantis in the desert, and they laugh, because Atlantis is supposed to be under the ocean, and this is the driest place on Earth. But that objection has a problem, a serious one, because the desert wasn't always a desert. And the map that points here isn't modern at all. It's a copy of something far older, and it shows a green Sahara crossed by rivers that no living person ever saw flow. The people who drew those rivers were right. We only proved it a few years ago. So hold 3 questions in your head, because we're going to answer all of them. Why does a Greek philosopher's lost city match a rock formation he could never have seen? Why do centuries-old maps of Africa draw lakes and rivers exactly where satellites now confirm ancient water once ran? And what did the people who lived on this ring actually leave behind in the sand before everything dried up and the world forgot they existed? Start with the shape, because the shape is the thing that stops you cold. The formation is called the Richat Structure. Locals call it Guelb Richat. The rest of the world calls it the Eye of the Sahara. It sits on the Adrar Plateau in western Mauritania, and it is roughly 40 kilometers wide, a bullseye of raised rock ridges with valleys sunk between them. From the ground, it is invisible. From space, it is one of the most striking features on the entire planet, listed alongside the Grand Canyon and Everest as a natural wonder. Now open Plato, not the myth, the text. In 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE, he describes a place built in exactly this pattern. Concentric rings, he says, alternating zones of water and land, wrapped around a central point. 3 rings of water, 2 of land. Look down at the Richat from orbit, and you are looking at alternating rings of raised rock and sunken valley, wrapped around a collapsed center. Not similar, not vaguely reminiscent. The same geometry. And then the measurement. This is where it stops being poetry. Plato gives a number. He says the Great Ring of the city spanned 127 stadia. Convert that ancient unit into modern distance, and you get roughly 23.5 kilometers. Now measure the inner ring system of the Richat structure. You land in the same range. A philosopher writing 24 centuries ago handed us a diameter, and a rock formation nobody would see for another 2,000 years matches it. For decades, scholars dismissed the rings as symbolic, a metaphor for order, for civilization, for the concentric harmony of a perfect society. And that reading works fine, right up until you notice the number. Metaphors don't come with a diameter attached. You don't write a fable and then specify 127 stadia. That's not how allegory works. That's how a description works. That's how a measurement works. Plato wasn't decorating, he was quoting. Here's where it gets strange. Plato was explicit about where he got the story. He said it did not come from him. It came from the Egyptian priests of the city of Sais, who told it to the Athenian lawmaker Solon, generations earlier. Solon wrote it down. The account passed through his family until it reached Plato. So the chain runs backward from Plato to Solon to a temple in Egypt to records the priests claimed were far older still. Plato is not the author. He is the last man to hold a document that was already ancient when he received it. And that changes the question completely. If this is a description that was copied and recopied across centuries before Plato ever touched it, then we are not asking whether one Greek imagined a circle. We are asking what the Egyptians were describing and where they got their information, and whether anyone ever tried to draw it on a map. They did. And the maps are the second clue, and they are stranger than the rings. Because if you go looking through old cartography, through the maps European scholars drew of Africa's interior in the centuries before anyone had crossed it, you find something that should not be there. They drew rivers, great river systems, running through the Western Sahara through exactly the region where the Richat sits. Lakes, water, in the middle of what every modern traveler knew as an ocean of sand. For a long time, these were treated as simple errors, fantasy geography, mapmakers filling empty space with decoration, the way they filled oceans with sea monsters. But that explanation has a problem, because those rivers were real. In the last few years, satellite radar that can see beneath the sand has traced enormous fossil river channels running across the Sahara, ancient waterways that carried real water toward the Atlantic thousands of years ago. Ground-penetrating imaging has mapped a buried river system in the Western Desert large enough to have sustained cities. The old maps weren't inventing water. They were remembering it. And the researchers who compared them side by side found that the medieval and early modern maps of Africa's interior line up again and again with the modern reconstructions of where the Green Sahara's rivers and lakes actually ran. That should not be possible. No European who drew those maps had crossed that desert. The information had to come from somewhere older, passed down, and copied forward centuries after the last river ran dry. Think about what that means. A piece of accurate geography describing a wet world that no living person had ever witnessed survived as inherited knowledge long enough to be printed as fact. The people copying it did not know why they were right. They just kept copying. The way you copy something you were told mattered, without knowing the reason. And if the memory of the rivers could survive that long, then so could the memory of what stood beside them. And the science behind that is now settled. Geologists and climate researchers call it the African humid period. Between roughly 14,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was green. Savanna, grassland, lakes, rivers, herds of animals, and people. Ancient DNA pulled from 7,000-year-old remains in a rock shelter in southwestern Libya confirms it. There were populations living across the Green Sahara, a previously unknown North African lineage, herding animals and burying their dead, thriving in a landscape we now picture as lifeless. The desert is young. The life came first. And it did not trickle away slowly. When the rains shifted, the Green Sahara collapsed into sand across a span of time short enough that the people living there would have watched their world end within a few generations. A continent of grassland became the emptiest place on the planet, and everything on it was covered over. So watch what just happened to the biggest objection. People say Atlantis can't be in the Sahara because Atlantis was destroyed by water and the Sahara is bone dry. But the Sahara was not always dry. It was drowned in the opposite way. Not swallowed by a rising sea, but abandoned by a vanishing one. The rivers left, the lakes evaporated, the green turned to sand, and whatever stood on that plain was buried, not beneath waves, but beneath the largest desert on Earth. Plato said Atlantis vanished. He didn't say it had to vanish underwater. A city can drown in sand just as completely as in sea. If you want to know what was actually built on that ring before the water left, keep watching, because this next part is the piece the geology textbooks don't want to explain. This is a channel that investigates the site's official history tells us to walk past. And this one is far from finished. Because the Richat is not empty. This is the clue that turns a rock formation into something harder to dismiss. Archaeologists working the structure have pulled human tools out of it. Not a handful. Vast quantities of stone artifacts, hand axes, worked blades, concentrated heavily in the outer rings, made from quartzite, quarried from the area itself. These are Acheulean tools, the signature of deliberate, organized human activity. People did not wander past the eye of the Sahara. They lived on it. They worked it. They chose it when it still had water, and they left the evidence packed into its rings. Now, stack Plato's other details against the ground truth, one at a time, and watch them land. He said the walls of the city were built from stone of 3 colors: red, white, and black. Go to the Richat today, and the rock of the region comes in red, white, and black, and local builders still use all 3. He said the land was rich in metal, gleaming with a substance he called orichalcum, which shone like fire. Mauritania today is a mining nation. Iron, gold, and copper come out of that ground. He said mountains stood to the north, and a great plain opened to the south. Look at the topography around the Richat, and you find high ground to the north and open plain to the south. Detail after detail, the description keeps matching the dirt. Any single one of these, on its own, means nothing. Rings erode into circles by accident. Deserts were greener once, everywhere. Old maps got lucky. Colored stone is common. This is the honest objection, and it deserves to be said plainly. So, let's slow down and be fair, because the case against this is real, and pretending otherwise would insult you. Does all of this prove that Plato's Atlantis was a literal city sitting in the Mauritanian desert? Probably not. And you should be suspicious of anyone who tells you it's certain. The mainstream geological explanation for the Richat is solid, and it is not a mystery. It is an eroded dome, an uplifted blister of rock pushed up by molten activity more than 100 million years ago, in the Cretaceous, long before any human existed to build anything. Erosion stripped the top away, the harder rock layers survived as ridges, the softer layers washed out as valleys, and the concentric pattern is simply what you get when you slice the top off a layered dome. No canals, no builders, no sunken empire. And the structure sits 400 meters above sea level, hundreds of kilometers inland, which fits badly with Plato's insistence that Atlantis was a naval power whose ships sailed into the sea. That is a strong case, and it should keep you grounded. But notice what the conventional story still cannot do. It cannot explain the measurement, the specific number of stadia that keeps landing inside the Richat's own rings. It cannot explain why old maps drew real, now confirmed rivers into a desert nobody had crossed. It cannot explain why the description came prepackaged through Egyptian priests as history rather than as one man's invention. And even the grounded version of this story is extraordinary on its own terms, because whether or not you call it Atlantis, the facts underneath are not in dispute. There was a green Sahara. There were people living on it. There were rivers running through it, remembered on maps long after they dried. There is a perfect ring of stone where a legend said a ring of stone would be, packed with the tools of the people who chose to live there. Strip away the word Atlantis entirely, and you are still left with a drowned world, a vanished landscape the size of a continent, full of human beings whose story we have almost completely lost, erased not by a flood, but by the slow closing of the desert over everything they knew. That is not a myth. That is prehistory, and we are only now beginning to read it. And if even the cautious version is right, if any real memory of that green world survived long enough to reach an Egyptian temple and be written down, then our history is missing a chapter. It would mean that a memory outlived the landscape that made it. That a description of a place and the people on it and the rings of water around it was carried across thousands of years by human hands, copied from record to record, long after the rivers stopped and the last inhabitants scattered. until it reached a philosopher in Athens, who wrote it down, not knowing that the place he was describing had turned to sand. They weren't inventing, they were remembering. The Richat Structure is still there tonight, still 40 kilometers wide, still ringed, still staring up out of the Sahara at the only vantage point that can see it. The rivers around it are still buried, dry channels traced only by radar, holding the shape of water that ran out before the pyramids were built. No excavation has ever gone looking in earnest for what lies beneath its center. The permits are not there, the funding is not there, and the eye keeps watching the sky, the way it has since long before anyone thought to look back. What is buried in the middle of that ring, under the sand, where nobody has dug. And if you want to know what else the ancient world left behind that we've been told to walk past, watch the next investigation on screen right now.